Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu salam wa ala Rasulillah. Amma ba'd. Welcome to my first episode, single episode on the features. And I would like to thank our brother Bilal Kennedy for allowing me to do this video for the features. And the topic that I'm going to be discussing today, by the permission of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is the issue of nationalism, specifically pseudo-nationalism as it relates to the African American and the African American experience. Now, before I delve into this, in Islam, we know that nationalism is, for the most part, not permissible in Islam. The nationalism wherein you view yourself as superior. You and the members of your group have a supremacy ideology, right? This is following the footsteps of Iblis, no doubt about it. And to look down on another group while simultaneously holding your group as superior, right? Again, the footsteps of Iblis. And this stems from kibr, arrogance, which is most definitely forbidden in al-Islam. But however, what I'm going to delve into, though, is the issue of nationalism with regards to wanting good for the people or the group that you yourself come from. There's no harm in this in Islam. There's no harm in this whatsoever. And the proof of that is we find this in Surah Al-A'raf, in that surah where Allah mentions all those prophets, Ya Qawmi, O my people. They all address their people like this, O my people, right? Whether you Lut, alayhi salam, Shu'aib, Hud, Saleh, Nuh, like this. They all say, O my people, worship Allah. You have no other deity, right? So we find that this was the way of the prophets in what? Calling their people, wanting good for their people. And we find this throughout the Quran, right? We find this throughout the Quran. We find this with Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam in many stories, right? Whether you're talking about him trying to call his uncle Abu Talib to Islam and to abandon the Tawaghit that he was worshiping, or whether or not you're talking about when Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam went to Ta'if to call the people to Islam and they threw stones at him. And the angel of the mountain asked Rasulullah alayhi salatu salam, did he want those people destroyed? For verily, he will sit the mountain on them. But Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam, out of love and concern, said, no, maybe from them, their offspring will become Muslim. They will worship Allah like this. So we find this throughout the Quran, the prophets and the messengers dealing with their people, calling their people to Tawheed, as well as warning them against shirk and other major sins, right? Lut alayhi salam was amongst his people when he was speaking out against liwat, homosexuality. This is the methodology of the prophets that we have to adopt when dealing with our people, the people that we come from. And it is from this foundation that I will be submitting the works of Dr. Amos Wilson to. This is called Pseudo-Nationalism, according to Dr. Amos Wilson. So I'm going to read from his book, The Psychology of Self-Hatred and Self-Defeat. And we will start on page 4. So Dr. Amos Wilson, he begins. He says, a week or so ago, I was making somewhat of a differentiation between what I call a pseudo-nationalistic individual or group and one that is more realistically nationalistic or truly nationalistic. One of the criteria I used was the relationship of the group to its children. I think to a degree, a pseudo-nationalistic group concerns itself almost exclusively with salvaging the hurt egos of adults. It's very important. He goes on, you find so many adults salvaging their egos and concerning themselves with history, which is not what they should concern themselves with exclusively. Very important. It's good to look at history, but you can't just stop at history in and of itself and by itself. So he goes on. I see too many adults whose heads are literally on backwards. They are continually facing the past and not looking to the future. There should be a concern with our glorious past, and history should be used to show up our pride and celebrate our genius as Black people. All right, so this is very important right here. He goes on to say, on page 5, one of the traits of true nationalists is that they are concerned with children. Very important. Being concerned with children, they are concerned about the education of their children. They are concerned about the legacy, economic, social, political, and otherwise, they will pass on to their children. They are not obsessed and compulsively concerned with the artifacts of their ancestors. While they respect them, study them, and revere them, gain from them psychological, political, and social sustenance, they also are concerned about creating a world for their children. It is not enough for them just to criticize Eurocentric education. They build an educational system for their children and see to it that the educational system works for them and their children. This has to be done if we are concerned about our survival. How else is our survival assured other than that the security and survival of our children are assured? This is very important. This is very important. You know, it's a lot that could be unpacked here. But the point that I want to focus on through reading this is to look at the reality of his statements about our propensity to look too much into the past without learning from it or without taking some valuable info from the past that can serve us in the present, that can move us in the future. You understand me? In other words, it is not enough for us to talk about the great empire of Shanghai, right? Or to talk about Mansa Musa, right? Or to talk about the Muslim empires, whether you talk about the Abbasid or the Umayyad and the likes. It's not enough for us to look at that history to see where we went wrong and where we were successful and stay there. And that's with regards to the Muslims. Now, with regards to the African Americans, we have the Islamic history, but we also have our own particular history for our group. And the same goes for other groups within the Muslim community. Now, in saying this, with regards to the African American, we have a unique history when it comes to slavery. Now, we know that slavery has always existed. No doubt about that. In every group. No doubt about that. However, what made the slavery different is that the transatlantic slave trade, we find that this was the first time in history that slavery was designated for a particular people, meaning black people are the new designated people for slaves, right? And we find this when we study the Arab slave trade. One of the reasons why Morocco, in addition to their coffers being empty, invaded Songhai, right? The Songhai Empire, right? Now, that's something that the ruler at that time, not going to mention his name. I know who it is, but I'm not going to mention his name. That's something he and the other Muslims from Morocco, they're going to have to answer to Allah for that, on why they conquered their Muslim brothers in the South, right? And why they conquered them, right? This is something they're going to have to answer to. However, in studying this, we find that the slave trade opened up. And we find that the Arabs had the longest slave trade. No doubt about it. It's no different from when they also raided the Barbary Coast. We understand this. We understand this. The point that I'm saying is, the point that I'm making is, African people were the designated group to be enslaved. And we find this through what? Various means. For example, the curse of Ham, right? Africans are supposed to descend from Ham, which makes them what? Subservient to the people of Shem, right? This what was used to justify the slavery of Africans, right? And we find here in the Americas that the native population, the Americans, one of the names I like to use, or the indigenes, right, or Native Americans, they were put in slavery as well. And there's a lot of history on that, a lot of books on that. I'm not going to delve into that too deep. The point I want to make, though, is the Spaniards put out a decree, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, right? They put out a decree that the native population aren't to be used as slaves anymore. We find these decrees. Now, the people didn't always listen, but at the same time, we start seeing a drop in Native American slavery and the rise of African slavery. So this is one of the things that made the slavery of Africans different from any other time in the world. This is what made it different, to the point that even now, when you think of slavery, you think of Africans. And we understand, we already know that there was European slavery. Even here in the United States, you had the indentured servitude, those who indentured servants, right? We understand this. And many of them was forced into chattel slavery. We understand this. But that wasn't the majority when you study this history. And a good book you can read on this, just for the sake of brevity, is White Cargo, right? A book called White Cargo. Fantastic book. Talks about white slavery. But even when studying that book, it differed tremendously from African slavery, right? So this is the reality of our history. And in saying that, we have endured a lot of trauma because our slavery was longer than the people that I just mentioned, like the people that you find in White Cargo, like the Germans, the Irish, the Scots, right? And then I mentioned the Native Americans. The Africans, for the most part, they were slaves much longer. This is a fact when it comes to the Americas, right? So the trauma is there. The trauma endures, right? So this is what we have to contend with, and these are things that we as a people have to deal with, right? The trauma that our ancestors went through, and then the trauma that they passed down. And this is another time when we get into the psychology of it and things of this nature. But what I'm getting at is that this trauma has caused many abnormalities with the African Americans, right? Such as what we're discussing, the psychology of self-hatred, self-defeat, right? Others say the issue of post-traumatic slave syndrome, right? And this is not to pathologize a whole race, no, but it's an attempt to explain some of the problems that we see with the African Americans today. So the African Americans, for the most part, have what? They have not really been able to acquire wealth. They have not been able to access quality education from their perspective, not from a Eurocentric perspective, their perspective, right? And these are things that Dr. Amos Wilson mentioned you have to work on and establish. You have to work on these things and establish them for the betterment and the future of the next generation. You have to be concerned with the next generation. We can't look at the past and complain about what our ancestors went through and what we're still going through, right? And I mentioned this many times, this is ruminating. We do not want to ruminate. No, you want to learn from the past, do a comparison contrast with the present, and then come up with some formulas and theories of your own on how you can move forward in conjunction with bringing your people on board, right? This is what you have to do. You have to be in the trenches. Just like the prophets that I just mentioned in the beginning, they were in the trenches. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam used to take time with the children. We have to take time with the children. We can go over the history of what our people went through and teach that to our children. No problem. But you have to use that in a way to navigate. We can't be like those black nationalists or those, some people call it Imhoteps, right? Look at the greatness of Egypt. Look at the pyramids. And then, okay. So Africans built the pyramids. Now what? Africa's still poor, despite having the most abundance of natural resources. The African Americans are still behind with regards to the racial wealth gap. In conjunction to, they suffer the most medical problems as a result of the oppression. You have to teach this to your children and show them the effects. But then you also have to push them to do better. And you have to establish things for them. And there's nothing wrong with you as an African American or a foundational Black American, indigenous, whatever you want to call yourself. There's nothing wrong with you ensuring the future of your people in the lands that you dwell in. It's nothing wrong. And we've already proven that in the very beginning with the prophets, right? We've already proven that in the very beginning. That's why I started off talking about them, because this is the spirit that I'm coming from, right? Utilizing the prophets as the examples that we must take in making sure or ensuring the survival of our people here in the United States, right? Whether Muslim or Kafir. Now, of course, as Muslims, the number one thing is to call them to what? Tawheed. No doubt about that. No doubt about that. But you also have to do those other things, right? Being neighborly, right? You also have to make sure that their children are okay when the children are outside playing, right? You have to be concerned with the police brutality that goes on. You also have to be concerned with what? You have to be concerned with the Black on Black crime, right? So there's nothing wrong with that. So we move on to Dr. Amos Wilson. He says, still on page 5, he says, do not let some person arguing about reverse racism turn you away from the use of your own money for our benefit. You have the right to use your own money to your own benefit and for the advancement of Black people. Black nationalism as an ideology has built into it the use of our own resources for ourselves. And this is a reality. This is a reality. And from that, we can also say that other groups are doing it, have done it, and are doing it. And no one says to them reverse racism. No, they are ensuring the survival of their group. So they establish businesses and they pass those businesses down to their children, right? Which brings me to another point, and Dr. Amos Wilson, he delves into that. And that is building for the next generation. You have to build for the next generation. As he mentioned in the very beginning, you have to be concerned about the children. If you're not concerned about the children and you just focus on your hurt and your ego, then you'll leave the children worse off than you. And this is the case. This is the reality with our people here in the United States of America. This is the reality. And we're paying the price. Not just non-Muslims, but Muslims as well. Because we are not building anything for them. And we're not saying when we build it, hey, this is for you. Because the children, although they're supposed to respect you, they need to see what it is that you're doing, right? So that they can model. As they get older, you become a practical example. My father, my mother, and the brothers, they all built this for us. They passed this down to us. Same in the masajid, right? You have the boards, but you have bright children who live in the community and they're teenagers. Sit them on the board, show them how to run a masjid, the day-to-day affairs, how to budget, right? They need to see how the masjid functions behind the scene. Why? Because they're growing. They need to be able to see this, right? But in many cases, we don't do this. So what happens is two things. One, you don't teach the children anything. And then when you get old, where are the children? They're not in the masjid. And in fact, because it's not enough of you, because your children didn't stay on board, other people take over the masjid. And then the original people who started the masjid are pushed out. These are realities. These are historical realities that has happened. And another thing that can happen when you don't build for your children, the children themselves can develop a resentment to the elders, especially if they're in a worse situation than the previous generation. And to prove this point, we're going to go into the book, Black on Black Violence, the Psychodynamics of Black Self-Annihilation, Service of White Domination. This book right here. Also by Dr. Amos Wilson. So, we find the part. All right, here we go. He says on page 175 of this book, he says, Black Americans, with their very sizable population, 12 to 15% of the general American population. Now this is old statistics, but we've always been in that, that demographic, that percentage. And there's a reason, I'm not going to go into it, but we've always been kept at that percentage, right? Of the general American population. And relatively large consumer wealth spends only about 5 cents of each of its consumer dollars with themselves. This is another issue that Dr. Claude Anderson always points out. You spend very little money on yourself. And it doesn't stay in your neighborhood. So other communities not only are spending their money on themselves and supporting them, but they're also getting your money. So anyway, moving on. He says, and 95 cents with others, right? So out of $1, you only spend 5 cents with your own people. The other 95 cents goes to other people. And in many cases, the other people don't have no love or respect for you. That's another issue. He says they invest relatively little of their earnings on wealth creating instruments. Very important. Pay attention. Activities, economic organizations, and real estate. Right? They don't invest in these things. Thus, the African American community spins itself into poverty. And though it possesses the capacity for tremendous economic growth and influence, it does not significantly use that capacity to create employment, purpose, wealth, and stability for its constituents, particularly its male members. This is very important. The organization, more aptly, disorganization of the African American economy and the psychoeconomic organization of the African American personality denies its children an economic inheritance, legacy, and tradition. By not leaving your children any economic organizations, investments, right? They don't have inheritance, legacy, and they most definitely don't have a tradition of doing so, for the most part. Hence, they become reactionarily dependent on the economic machinations of their oppressors and exploiters. Very important. In other words, you want to teach them to be self-sufficient, but you haven't invested. So they have to seek sustenance outside of you. The failure of the African-American leadership and professional classes, petty bourgeois, and business classes to apparently organize a coherent and cohesive Afrocentric economic system is tantamount to a rejection of their historic role and a betrayal of their people and their children. These betrayed children are the ones which criminally assault their elders with a special hostility and vengeance. The failure of the African-American middle class to invest in African economic development and empowerment is itself criminal, right? Is itself criminal. Very important. Very important. So a lot of the black on black crime we see with the youth is no doubt from poverty. No doubt about that. African Americans always been in poverty since slavery up to now, right? And we can delve into on another time through history all those parts of history, Reconstruction, right? And the Freedmen's Bank, the failure of the Freedmen's Bank, right? African Americans not being able to participate in the Homestead Act, right? These are things that we know. Being cut out of the New Deal and the Fair Deal during the presidency of FDR, right? Knowing the reality of what presidents caused us the most economic harm, such as Andrew Johnson, FDR, right? Like this. So we can delve into those issues. All these things contributed to the poverty that we see in African Americans, no doubt about it. The African Americans didn't create the situation. However, what has happened though is the African Americans not focusing on themselves to build the future generations, right? It's like the moment African Americans start getting a taste of the American dream, they were only concerned with making it, right? Going right back to what Dr. Amos was saying about what? The egos, right? Adult egos, not being concerned with the future of the children, right? And this is why when we look at the European Americans, right? Like this big issue with critical race theory. It's politicized. Most of everything we do is politicized, right? So states have put legislation in, no critical race theory, right? Various states, right? Although critical race theory was never taught in schools anyway. You only learn it in college, primarily in the master's degree level, right? Unless you someone who just reads a lot and you in constant contact with professors, right? And you can discuss a lot of these things with them, right? But for the most part, it's not taught in the general public like that. It's not, you know, but it was pushed, right? It was pushed. This is white people, right? European Americans taking a stand, right? They're worried about their children, right? They're worried about their children because, like, for example, in Tennessee, no one verified it, but some little European American girl came home. She felt ashamed of being white. And the mother wanted to ascertain why my daughter feeling like this. And it was talking about slavery and what African Americans went through. So she had a problem with that, right? And so now what are we hearing? They've pushed the narrative, don't make white people feel bad about the past, right? But overall, not all, but when you look at the group overall, none of them has done anything to ensure that black folks don't feel bad with their microaggressions, right? No one cared about the psychology of African Americans when you left African Americans that played a role in the founding of the United States out of the history books. What was the concern for the psychology of African Americans then, right? So these are realities that we have to deal with. And that's a whole nother story about the psychology of the European American with regards to them pushing their narrative and them feeling comfortable, as opposed to you telling your story and you're feeling comfortable, right? That's a whole nother issue. It's okay for us to feel bad, but it's not okay for them to feel bad, right? They're not saying that, but your actions, this is what you're telling me, right? So these are points that, we really have to, be cognizant of. Study history, right? To what? To be able to navigate. Don't ruminate. But at the same time, you owe it to yourself and your children to know your history and to know your present so you can navigate in the future. Because African Americans, and when I say African Americans, I'm talking about the Caribbean, the Afro-Latinos, right? The Canadians, the African Americans of Canada, right? We have just as much right to be concerned with our survival as other groups. No doubt about that. So, in ending, I like to end with part of the advice that Luqman gave his son, right? Luqman al-Hakim. Luqman said, "O my son, establish the prayer, enjoin al-ma'ruf, right? Enjoin the good, and forbid the evil, al-munkar, right? And bear with patience whatever befalls you. Verily, these are some of the important commandments ordered by Allah," right? That's that part of Surah Luqman, right? So, here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he quotes Luqman, alayhi salam, "O my son, establish the prayer," right? And as Muslims, we can't reiterate this enough, right? Establish the prayer. Not going to go deep into the Salat. We know the importance of it, right? Allah tells us that the Salat removes fahsha wa munkar, right? Lewd and evil deeds, right? That's what Allah tells us, right? The salat cleanses you of sins, right? Like the famous hadith, Rasulullah alayhi salam said, if any of you went to the stream 5 times a day and clean themselves, will there remain on you any dirt? He said, no, Messenger of Allah. He said, the salat is like that, right? These are things we know, right? So Luqman tell him, establish the salat. Establish it. So we also need to what? Call on Allah at night, right? Bilal talks about this all the time, right? Rasulullah used to get it in, right? I mentioned this in other talks I've done on the 5-2 initiative, right? You know, seek help in Allah, asta'inu bis-sabri was-salat, with patience and what? Prayer, right? Inna Allah masabirin, verily Allah is with those who are patient, right? So then Luqman tells him to enjoin the good and forbid the evil. Now Sheikh Abdul Razak, Ibn al-Imam Sheikh Abdul Muhsin al-Abad, he says that enjoining the good, he said this is everything that's good, right? This everything that's good. And at the top of that is Tawheed, by calling your people to Tawheed. I just mentioned in the very beginning, what? The prophets calling their people to what? Tawheed. And then dealing with what? Their issues, right? Have to take them as an example. But Sheikh Abdul Razak, he says, at the top of it is Tawheed, and at the end of it is what? Removing something harmful out of the tariq, right? Out of the pathway or roadway, however you want to translate tariq, right? And it's based on the hadith, right? Al-Iman sab'un al-shu'bah, right? Iman has 70 odd branches, right? The highest is to say La ilaha illallah, and the lowest is to remove something harmful from the street, right? And he said, "Wal haya afdal iman," right? And haya, right, is a branch of iman, right? Haya, like shyness, right? So this is a branch of iman. So Sheikh Abdul Razak, he's saying, do all that is good, because al-ma'ruf here is everything that is good, right? Everything that is good, you do. And forbid the evil, right? And from that evil, what? Shirk. Because Luqman told his son in the same, but verily what? Shirk dhumul adhim, right? It is a great oppression. Shirk, right? And then the lesser things, right? What's my point in mentioning this? Like I said in the very beginning, take you around in a circle. We have to be on the front line dealing with our people, calling our people to Islam, but also working with our people who aren't Muslim. Everybody not going to accept Islam. You still don't abandon your people. You still help your people. You still what? Have to be neighborly, right? And we're not going to get into the rights of the jar, right? The neighbors, right? It's tremendous in Islam, right? But in saying this is general. But if you live amongst your people, or you want to ensure the survival of your people, then these are things you have to do. You have to call on Allah, establish the salat, and you have to enjoin the good, forbid the evil. We got to be right out there on the front lines. It's just that simple. Talking about black on black. We're in the neighborhood. You need to pull that young guy to the side. Talk to him. Right? We used to have that old saying back in the day, each one teach one. You have to show concern for your people. Because if you don't, then you're just pseudo-nationalistic, right? You're pseudo. You're not even a real nationalist. You really don't want good for your people, right? How can you, as an African American, just turn your nose up at your people, but you're not doing anything to help? And this has been a huge problem amongst the Muslims all over the country, African American Muslims. We put ourselves in a bubble. Not all of us, but many of us, if not most of us, right? These are your people. We should be out there just like those prophets. Yah call me, oh my people. Starting with your family, and then your neighborhood like this. You need to be at those neighborhood meetings to discuss the violence in your neighborhood, if you live in such neighborhoods. You need to be building relationships and bridges with the non-Muslim organizations who have the same concerns that you have with gun violence in your neighborhood. There's nothing wrong with you teaming up with Muslim and non-Muslim groups to discuss the systemic racial issues in this country. There's nothing wrong with that. And last but not least, and I reiterate the statements of Dr. Amos Wilson, stop worrying about reverse racism. Do what you're supposed to do. Do that which is right. You have to be an example to your people, and you most definitely have to help. We don't just sit back and all those kuffar. You can do that, but they're your people. And many of the things that they suffer, you yourself suffer. Many of the issues that they suffer, you also, many of us, suffer from those same issues. So we must take the steps in dealing with the issues, the evils within our groups. We have to. And we have to teach the youth how to be better than us. We have to come up with curriculums so that the children can see that we're investing in them. We're going to have to figure out ways on working on the psychological trauma of not trusting each other, not sharing money with each other, not going into business with each other. Now, many African Americans are breaking that stigma, right? Many, but it's not enough of us, right? So with that, I'll end this video. And again, my advice to the African Americans, be concerned with your people. Even if you are married to someone outside of your group, you are still not absolved for enjoining the good and forbidding the evil that takes place within your group. You're not absolved because you are from those people, and your marrying outside of your people does not in no shape, form, or fashion detract from that reality. So this is what I want to present. If there was anything good, it was from Allah. If anything beneficial, it was from Allah. No doubt about that. However, if there was anything evil or inaccurate, then it is from myself and the shaitan. Make no mistake about that one. So we end this video on pseudo-nationalists, and we ask Allah to touch our heart to get more involved in doing the things that we have to do for our families, for the Muslims, and then for our people. We ask Allah to give us courage and knowledge to delve in these issues. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bring the professionals and the Tulab al-Ilm together to formulate plans and strategies and not bring their egos when they come to formulate these plans and strategies for the future of not only Muslim African Americans, but African Americans in general, especially if you live in the same neighborhood and there are a lot of non-Muslims. You have to be concerned with everybody in the neighborhood. Again, the rights of the jar, the neighbors, right? We ask Allah to make this easy, and we ask Allah to grant us patience as we tackle these issues and keep us firm on his deen and knowledgeable of his deen. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik, shadu la ilaha illa ant, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.